Today we have Anthony Grove joining our podcast. He's a senior financial leader, have been around revenue cycle, payer relations, all across the board from hospital billing to professional billing. So we can get to a lot of good stuff today. And also he's the author of Healthcare in the United States. It's an awesome book, and I can't wait to share more about that. So Anthony, I know that you actually started from, rev cycle wasn't your dream job to start, right? How did you get into the world?
A healthcare enterprise found me and brought me as an accountant. And the more that I worked in the accounting, I realized that the day-to-day transactions that I went to college to learn for financial reporting, balance sheets, financial statements, all of that, the real energy in the healthcare side was over in the reimbursement. It was extremely complex. Nothing like that had ever been shared with us in college. And my appetite for detail and troubleshooting seemed to resonate quite well. So after I left an accounting job, I went and started serving in large health systems. It's been a very satisfying career over the years.
You have talked about how, the discipline manifests itself slightly differently, but also there's some universal pattern across different specialty. I know you're both most recently in radiology. Can you share a little bit more about what you're seeing that is like radiology specific, but also universal across the board?
Yeah, when you think about the healthcare, the financial side, the reimbursement engine, you always have to keep in mind that we're all dealing with standardized code sets, standardized claim forms, certain transaction sets that we've all come to learn and love, all of that. Each of the disciplines has its own little nuance. So there's nothing terribly radical about any of the different disciplines I've seen, whether they're healthcare, in the medical side of healthcare, or even dental. You're using the standardized code sets. Within radiology, there are a higher propensity of modifiers, average per case, than you see in other disciplines, at least from my view. And you also have to keep in mind when you're doing radiology that it comes in really two pieces. There's a technical piece to create the image. There's a professional piece to read and interpret that. And when you roll them together, it becomes a global. It's also very authorization dependent, because depending on the level of an image that you're going to create, there's a vast difference in cost. So there are typically plans that will require prior authorization, clinical documentation to even approve those outpatient services.
Let's double click on prior auth a little bit, because that's what we're hearing a lot. So with payer using technology to streamline the process, I think a lot of provider is catching up on how they can manage prior auth. And sometimes it's actually an eligibility problem, right? Like they have the wrong insurance on file, thus they were checking prior auth on the wrong thing. Like how did you manage that when you're running the professional side?
So you have to train people that prior authorization is not a blank check. You can't develop a mindset that says, well, we'll get a prior auth, that way we're guaranteed payment. You still have to document medical necessity. It still has to be an appropriate diagnosis for the service. So I've trained providers over the years to modify their SOAP note to kind of think about, how do I sell the concept of the value of the service to somebody who's paying for it? Because all prior authorization goes back to, you have to justify the spend. So another section of the note that I encourage providers to indicate is, what are the potential consequences of not treating this case? What can happen if we don't run clinical interference? And that creates a whole new strategy of thinking for providers. Instead of focusing on, in the record, what is being done, you now start focusing on why you're doing it. I also encourage providers to diagnose comorbidities. Don't always just diagnose the case upon the problem-focused visit. Let's bring all the comorbidities to the table too, so we can help paint that healthcare picture for the payer.
When you implement those recommendations, do they look like templates? Because I think in single specialty, sometimes you can scale with a couple patterns, or did you actually have a provider like write that narrative each time? Because that could be a documentation load that people may not want to do.
No, what we did on the training is we took some mock scenarios. We talked about, patient presenting for a particular problem and what maybe the diagnosis code could look like. Then we took it to the next level, and we started telling the clinical story about the consequences of non-treatment, talked about the other comorbidities that the patient was dealing with, and then in the end, we showed the distinct differences where we harvested more diagnosis codes. And we could show the provider who would come back to us and say, I've never really thought about doing it that way, but I see your point. You're proving to somebody that this is a necessary service, thus they need to pay for it. And that's really what prior authorization is all about. A lot of times what you're dealing with is large employer groups. The employer is looking at their spending. They're having their team analyze cost, and they're reading records, and maybe they brought a clinical person in, and they're getting a report back that says, we're paying for a lot of things, but we're not sure that we can justify in the record that this was all necessary. So that's the missing piece. You have to make sure that you're justifying the spend.
And on the other side, so we talked about clinical necessity, which is really driving both the prior auth, but really the denial appeal side of the story as well. We talked about training provider. How about AR team? Another really common problem I hear from physician practice is that my AR team couldn't work through all the denials. It's hard to know what to prioritize. They're burnout. Like, how did you go about that?
So there's a couple different approaches to dealing with denials, and a lot of it depends upon the level of training and education with your team. You have to first train people to understand that denials or zero pays or rejections, whatever we want to call them, they can be cryptic messages that we have to train people how to read and interpret those messages. What is the payer saying? And, many years ago, we took a group of people who really just, like you said, they didn't understand how to distinguish. And we said, well, read and interpret the message. Is the payer trying to say that somebody else has to pay for this? Are they saying that, and that would include it's an uncovered service, things like that. Are they saying that they need more than the claim? We got your claim, but we need the record, the reports, the progress notes. Are they trying to say that there's something wrong with the claim? There's missing or incomplete information, or we're not even the right payer? Sort them in broad categories first, then you can have a team that specializes in a smaller group. Now, as the group becomes more refined and you start looking at things like denials for prior auth, and you're looking at it saying, I know we got this authorized, so what's going on? You can find a variety of different challenges in there. You can find payer error. And then what we did is we built a letter series that was very well laid out, very professional looking on letterhead, had a nice embossed signature on it. And we would train the team on diagnose the scenario, choose the right appeal letter, fill in the blank, upload it to the payer website, start the appeal. In more than half the cases, you're able to have success with that because the person at the other end who's looking at that, you're making a credible argument. They look at the letterhead, they look at the records that are attached, and they're saying, yeah, let's pay this one. If you put together something very, very sloppy, very abbreviated, it may not carry the same weight. Another one that's popular in prior authorization is maybe it was authorized within a date range, and for whatever reason, the service occurred outside the date range. You have to train people to think differently. The argument we used was if you, as a health plan, were comfortable approving the service within a certain date range, you're certainly comfortable approving the service if you're a little bit outside the date range. The patient wasn't, clinically healed within that period. And that's enough to get the payer to look at it and say, that's a good point. Let's go ahead and process this for payment. But if you don't create your argument, you're not going to be successful. I trained people to think really like a lawyer would. Here's a case that's denied. We provided the service. The patient needed care. What's our argument? Even in cases where you completely failed to get authorization, we created an argument for that. We said the patient needed the care. It was an appropriate course of treatment. You would have approved this had we approached you. You can be successful with those. You have to be persistent with it. You have to be professional. You have to be organized. You can't just sweep them in a pile and give up and say, oh, well, they got denied.
Half of them may get overturned, right? What we have seen is it may take several follow-ups. How did you approach that, right? Say that you have made a sound argument, it gets dismissed the first time. Second time around, do you repeat that message? Do you try something different? Do you insert your phone call? What's your strategy?
You'll have to envision a grid that has, the level, the first level appeal letter that would go out, and maybe there's two more if those aren't successful. And eventually it would come to me if we found that we had something that we couldn't crack the ice on. And I would have to make the decision, am I going to escalate this through payer relations, or, is this one that we're just not going to be successful with? So we were persistent with it. We tracked them all. Every single appeal was logged, and we knew the business unit. I also used it in my payer relations. When we were doing contract negotiation, I could go back to plans and remind them that they're creating quite a cost burden for us because we are getting these cases authorized, but yet we're forced to go back and appeal them to get paid. So I was putting discussion on the table about paying us so much in appeal, adjusting the fee schedule to cover the cost of it. I was transferring the accountability back to the payer to say they have to own that problem.
I remember you telling me one time, like, instead of bringing lawyers to the conversation, you actually just show up yourself. It was a refreshing take. Would love to. Can you share more about that?
So a couple of times in my career, we've had pretty substantial disputes with payers. And I went through the contract provisions, put them on notice. If you couldn't work it out, then we would file arbitration. And when I would go to meet with the payer, it's usually at that point that you file the arbitration. They realize that, okay, you've read the contract, you've got a strong argument. I chose to represent the provider myself because me showing up by myself with my evidence is a much different dynamic than me showing up with two or three lawyers with me. That's worked several times to get a payer to realize that, okay, we're not going to go away quietly. And we actually use that to kind of foster the relationship. You can gain a lot of respect from the plans, not by just picking a fight, but by showing them that you've studied it, you know the material, you've identified where the failures occurred, maybe in their system, and you're prepared to defend your position.
Yeah, and I think that gives reassurance because a lot of the times physicians may be avoiding the conversation, right? They were like, we spent years getting a contract finally in place. I did not want to put any strain on the relationship.
Well, keep in mind that the dispute resolution in these contracts is almost exclusively authored by the plan themselves. They're the ones that put the step together. The informal dispute resolution notice that goes to a particular address by certified mail or whatever the delivery option is, they wrote that language. If you can't resolve it in 60 days, then you have the right to file arbitration, typically within a year of giving the initial notice. That's language that the plan wrote. I've had conversation before where people will ask me, gosh, will they cancel our contract? They could, but I've never seen that. If somebody you're working with is maybe a little frustrated that you actually filed the arbitration, I'm reminding them that that's the language that they chose. And if there's another course of action, the next time we renegotiate the contract, we can build that step in there. But also, by the time you file arbitration, you may not even have had an initial response to your informal dispute. So some plans, they wait for the provider to file arbitration, and then that's the ones they're going to work on. I've seen it build relations because they respect you. They know that you understand your rights.
Yeah. And I think that is like a lot of times you actually emphasize understanding both sides really well, their incentive, right? What the payer had put in place. Sometimes it's pretty reasonable. And also how the provider, the health system is structured. So you can actually provide a sound argument that represents both sides.
Absolutely.
And then I do want to talk about like the details a little bit operation wise. So we talked about workflow, strategy, how to train people, like in the day-to-day management. When you were talking about having well-designed buckets, AR team working the letters, do you use the software or is it more just like, the good old Excel? Like, how did you manage the day-to-day?
Well, Excel works just fine. And most people have access to that through their cloud-based system. And today with all that, you can share those files really easily. But then from there, you have people within your organization that are really good at running pivot reports and identifying hotspots with different payers. So I use tools where we could organize the data and get everyone to have good access to it. I didn't go spend a lot of money on custom software packages. Before we would work on an appeal, we would log it and create kind of a unique ID for it that we would follow it through internally. and then we could do success reporting.
In terms of time range, what's the range you would monitor to say, okay, this strategy is working? 30 days, or do you wait out the 60, 90 days based on payer behavior?
If you start measuring it early, you have to understand that some of those cases are still in a work queue in the payer. So you have to just measure it perpetually over time. My experience is you're going to know within the first 30 days, you're going to get a sense for how successful it is. Some of these are turned around the day they open them up because, again, they're looking at the argument, saying it's credible, it carries a lot of weight, let's just process and pay it.
And then switching gears to, this is still in denial world, but underpayment specifically. I think you mentioned sometimes you realize that you're overpaid or you're underpaid, right? How did you go about that process?
There's a lot of software out there that claims to be able to identify under and overpayments. And I've always encouraged the provider to have a payment integrity program, but you've got to be ethical about how you do this. If you're going to look at the payment and evaluate it against the contract, you may also find overpayments too. I've had it both ways. I've had underpayments and overpayments. It's not just saying, let's just focus on the underpayments and we'll just keep the overpayment, focus on the underpayment and keep the overpayment in our pocket. That doesn't build a very good trust relationship with the payer community. I did a lot of it through random sample auditing. If you pull a sample of 2 to 3% of all payments, trace them back, you're likely going to find most of them are just fine. It's not, a lot of times you hear providers think that the payer is up to no good. They're trying to smoke it past them. But a lot of it is just transaction keying errors. Something wasn't loaded properly. I mean, I had a contract many years ago in the health system where we could see right away that we were being way overpaid on a DRG basis. And we looked at this and I ran the numbers and I said, I think I see the problem. There's a transposition error in the base rate entry. Because when I kept taking it back to what I thought the payment should be, and I kind of did the math, I said the base rate must be much different than it really should be. And that's what it was. They had a keying error in the base rate, which vastly increased the reimbursement. We caught it right away.
On the payer side, you mentioned like the base rate they had is wrong.
Yeah, they loaded the wrong base rate on a DRG. We had cases, more than a few cases, where the reimbursement was higher than the charges. And I've seen that before.
Was it even more over than the charges? Because that was unheard of.
Yeah, it was just really interesting to see that it was a transposition error. And, they were very appreciative of us being honest about it and open about it. And we had a great rapport. And I won't tell you what payer it was, but it's one that a lot of times people don't have good rapport with, but we had a fantastic rapport.
And I think it makes future appeal easier, right? Because you have built the trust that you're not going after all the dollars, but actually the integrity, the solution that makes sense.
Yeah, I've had companies approach me before to say, even if you're underpaid by, $5, you need to pursue that. Well, you also have to keep in mind that there's a balance here. If I'm out on the Florida Turnpike and I'm doing 72 miles an hour and a patrolman pulls me over and writes me a ticket for that, it's well within their right to do that. But is that a reasonable effort? I've seen providers who can become too aggressive with it, and the payer starts looking at it saying, well, we're not perfect and you're not perfect either. Maybe we should start taking a look at a few of your medical records. Now what's happening is your relationship is beginning to degrade. And we put our communication to the patient together the same way we did the payer. Make it look important, make it look credible, come to the point, and you'll get a much better response rate that way. So, yeah, there's many opportunities.
Yeah, and I think like that, I do want to highlight that piece because we have seen a lot of appeal letter that is literally just demanding a payment, but they were a little bit brief on the argument. They didn't have the nice signature letterhead, right? Those are the details that do matter a lot.
I put a lot of emphasis on form. If it looks important, it's going to get the right attention. If it looks abbreviated and quick and just, not very articulate, then it's not going to get the level of credibility that's needed. So you have to consider your presentation. And I train the team. When we're going to make an appeal, what's going to be our argument? Pay me because I'm the provider. That's not a good argument. Let's not take advantage of the fact that we missed it. The patient still received the care. You would have approved it anyhow. You have to train people to think like that. And that is typically a new era for people to say, okay, I got to get creative. What would be a good argument for that? I've had cases before where, you're doing provider enrollment and maybe there's a couple of services that were performed before the provider was actually enrolled in the plan. I experimented. I went back and appealed those and said, this is a provider that you found value in and you did add to the plan. And here's a couple of services that are, before they were fully enrolled. Would you pay that? We would like you to pay those. And not every single time, but I've seen those get paid because the argument is you did enroll a provider. This is before then, but you obviously found value in that provider, admitted them to the network. So let's pay this too.
I'm sure you approach out-of-network claims similarly, right?
Without of network, you are many times dealing with just the contract language of the plan. There's typically a very tall deductible in there. With the No Surprises Act, patients coming through hospitals are, of course, handled differently. But with elective procedures where somebody's out of network, the way we did that was we used our financial clearance program to identify that condition up front and then make the patient aware of it through a patient advocacy program that the plan they chose or was chosen for them has limitations and restrictions. We want a network provider would go towards a deductible, or we could offer them a cash and carry price. And often the patient would choose the cash and carry price because they would come back and say, I know I'm not going to meet my deductible anyway. So if we can do a cash and carry that's less, let's just do that. Everyone's happy then.
Yeah. And when we have time, everyone check out Anthony's book because he actually talks about how car accident and insurance program in hospitals work that way. I think there's a lot of tips every day everyone can take away, even though if you're not working in revenue cycle or healthcare.
Absolutely.
So one final question, any advice for fellow peers in rev cycle today? Like many of them are looking at AI, thinking about automation, trying to make their staff more efficient, happier. Like what advice would you give to them?
My message will be, you have to first understand the details. The reimbursement side of healthcare is extremely complex. I don't think you'll hear anyone ever say it's not. You really need to develop the appetite to understand the claim form details, the mechanics of how the data flows, so that you can really diagnose the problems. A lot of times I use a lot of analogies where you're trying to diagnose a problem. What happened? And in one of my stories, I talked about $32 million of claims that were they were up to 6 months old. They had accumulated about $32 million of unprocessed claims, and nobody could get them paid by Medicare. The software vendor couldn't figure it out. The current leadership couldn't figure it out. It was given to me. I asked for 6 claims. I asked for the EOBs that accompanied those 6 claims. And I noticed something. I noticed that the remit from CMS, from Medicare, the MAC, was saying, they were asking, where's the room and board charges? Well, that alone, unless you understand the claim form, wouldn't solve the problem. What I realized was these are outpatient same-day surgery charges. They're looking for a room and board charge because there's something on the claim suggesting to them that this is inpatient care. The bill type was fine. They had the right bill type. They were putting an admitting diagnosis on the claim form. That was one of the areas that they were doing. And the software with the MAC said, oh, I see an admitting diagnosis, and that's only appropriate on inpatient admissions. So where's my revenue code for room and board? I pieced that together and said, there's your problem. You're overutilizing the fields on the claim form. These are outpatient claims. You don't need an admitting diagnosis. Got with the software vendor, cleaned it up. We got every one of those claims to adjudicate.
Makes sense. And I think there's a lot of details in the form. People tend to not everyone is as familiar with the boxes, right? So having someone, or at least training the team to have the full picture and knowing here's the exact levers for those scenarios is key, because otherwise the system on the other end may pick up things that they shouldn't.
Way back when I got into the reimbursement side of healthcare, when I looked at those claim forms, to me, they kind of reminded me of income tax forms. There were fields that were very specific on what goes there. And I guess I was hungry enough to learn about this that I went and read through the claim form manuals. And I said, oh my goodness, this is just a wealth of information. We can train people to do things. It delivers a lot of data to the payer that otherwise may get a pending claim where the payer comes back and says, what's going on here? So we did a lot of training and education on how to use those codes, what they're for. Not every code is appropriate for every episode of care, but we took the popular ones and made people aware. And what I discovered was no one had ever been trained on any of that. It was really a basic data entry, almost like a hotel reservation, and they would just kind of hope for the best. But we were able to up our reimbursement, get our day sale outstanding down because our claims were more complete.
Goes back to clean claim. The devil's in the details.
Correct. So my advice is you've got to go back and have an appetite for the details. You can't just rely on Chat GPT to figure everything out. You have to have a good understanding. And if I can do it, you can do it. So it's a matter of understanding the claim, what the standards are, what belongs in what field. When we look at the professional claim form, in almost every case, when we talk about an NPI number associated with the charge, it's the NPI of the individual provider, not the group. Okay. The patient encounter was done by a human being, not the group. And training people on the differences of taxonomy codes. There are taxonomy codes representative of people, places, and things. Okay. So, there's a difference between a oral surgeon and a multi-specialty practice, and understanding how those codes work and what's appropriate.
Love it. And Anthony, thank you for joining us today on the Healthcare Intelligence Podcast. Can't wait for your next book to come out. And we have the link in the bio, so everyone, please go check it out.
Thank you so much, Charlene. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise.